This man claimed to be immortal and history can't prove otherwise.
Hey, 42 here. In 1743, an unusual man was seen in the city of London for the first time. He had dark hair, looked to be around 45 years of age, and was simply but expensively dressed. Over the following 5 years, this stranger would become one of the most talked about people amongst London's high society. As for why, well, that's going to take a bit of explaining. For one thing, there was the fact that he was a virtuoso violinist and composer. Then there were the rumours that he could speak every single European language with the fluency of a native speaker.
What?
And that he had an encyclopedic knowledge of world history. He was also said to have had certain unusual talents, like the ability to remove flaws from diamonds, and even to turn base metals into gold. As interesting.
He's a what is it? He's one of the alchemists from Full Metal Alchemist. He learned. He got the Philosopher's Stone. How'd he do that?
Interesting as all those things were, there was something even more intriguing about this mysterious stranger. Nobody had any idea who the bloody hell he was. People who run in aristocratic circles typically have family histories that date back centuries. But this man was different. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that before he turned up in London in 1743, it was almost like he didn't exist at all. No matter how much anyone tried, and believe me, people did try, nobody could work out who he was or where he'd come from. A historyless nobleman was odd enough to begin with, but in this case, it was especially strange. This man was clearly spectacularly well educated, yet nobody knew where he'd studied. He played the violin like a concert soloist, but nobody knew who taught him. And he was also clearly extremely rich. But as for where that money came from, nobody knows.
Moneybag man.
Just didn't make any sense. And here we are, almost 300 years later, and it still doesn't make any sense. At least not unless you're prepared to believe what might just be the greatest tale ever told. This is the story of the Count of Saint-Germain, the first human being ever to attain immortality.
Yeah.
Maybe.
He did the immortality surgery.
Okay, so it's getting to that time of the year when it starts to get colder and darker outside, and many of us might start to feel a little lonelier. Now, some people might think that therapy is only for those with clinical issues like depression or anxiety. The man who called himself the Count of Saint-Germain, amongst many other names, takes the idea of mysterious origins to a whole new level. With Genghis Khan, or Temujin, as he was called back then, we know he was born somewhere in what is now Mongolia within a few years of 1160 AD. With the Count of Saint-Germain, we know basically nothing. Most sources quote his date of birth as either 1691 or 1712. But according to the man himself, those dates are out by several hundred years. Some people have claimed they might be out by thousands. As for where
this man's from the Void Century.
He was born, we quite literally don't even know which country, let alone which town or city. We don't even know the man's real name. That level of obscurity in a famous historical figure is unusual, to say the least. Exactly how he came to be in London in 1743 is anyone's guess. No records have survived to tell us how he got there or where he came from. But despite having apparently apparated out of thin air, he quickly became an important part of the London scene, where, to begin with, he was mostly known for his prodigious talent as a musician and composer. The Count was said to be amongst the very best violinists in Europe
he was going
at the
crazy
time,
on the violin.
capable of bringing audience members to tears with the beauty of his music. He's also credited with composing several songs for a popular London opera. At some point, he made the transition from celebrated musician to high society dandy, becoming one of the most anticipated dinner guests in all of London. But despite his growing reputation, it's safe to say nobody really knew quite what to make of him. One of the first written accounts of his time in England comes to us from writer and politician Horace Walpole, son of former Prime Minister Robert Walpole. And it shows just how much
That's
of an
gotta be
enigma
who
the Count
that one
really
who
was.
Walpole is based off of.
He
One Piece.
sings,
Actually,
plays on
yeah.
the violin wonderfully, composes, is mad, and not very sensible. He is called an Italian, a Spaniard, a Pole, somebody that married a great
Has to be based
fortune in
off of
Mexico
this
and
person.
ran away with her jewels to Constantinople. A priest, a fiddler, a vast nobleman. The Prince of Wales has had an unsatiated curiosity about him, but in vain. In other words, even in his own time, nobody had a clue exactly who or what the Count of Saint-Germain was. Which is probably why, around 2 years after first arriving on British
Mysterious aura, nobody know him.
soil, he was arrested
He got a lazy eye.
on suspicion of being a spy. 1745 was the year of the so-called Jacobite Rebellion, an attempt by Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, to seize the British throne for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart. The details of this uprising aren't too important for our purposes, but what is important is that the Jacobite rebels had the support of France. Bearing in mind that the Count of Saint-Germain spoke fluent French and seemed to have appeared as if from nowhere 2
They
years
said
earlier,
he speak fluent
it's
everything.
fair to say he seemed to be perfect spy material. He was arrested and taken in for questioning, but apparently not even the threat of a bit of good old-fashioned 18th century British justice could convince him to tell the authorities, well, anything. He wouldn't say who he really was or where he'd come from, and he freely admitted that the Count of Saint-Germain was neither a real aristocratic title nor his actual name. As far as cover stories go,
He's a nameless man.
it wasn't great. I'd have had him swinging from the nearest gallows in a heartbeat. But the Count had
He's
two
just
things
the
on his
Count of
side.
Saint Germain.
One, during his time in England, he'd made a few friends in very high places. And two, he was in possession of a natural charm and charisma that would make George Clooney look like a football hooligan with a mouthful of doner kebab. And so, despite flatly refusing to cooperate in any capacity, the Count was eventually freed without charge.
Oh yeah.
On his release, he went straight back
I'm
to the
out.
kind
I'm
of
out of the
high
chains.
society life he'd been enjoying before. He dined with all the great families and attended all the best parties. By all accounts, he was a dazzling dinner guest, able to talk with great authority and insight on almost any subject, especially world history. In fact, he had an uncanny ability of describing important historical events in such detail, it was almost as though he'd witnessed them
there.
with his own eyes. The Count of Saint-Germain
That man was out there when Genghis Khan the first battle started. He was going crazy.
was the archetypal international man of mystery. But you can't be an international man of mystery without being, well,
Who's saying who's saying he not immortal?
And so, in 1748, he
You wanna come kill him?
relocated to
Find
France. As was the case in England, despite his deep and murky roots, the French aristocracy welcomed him into their midst with open arms. In fact, if anything, they were even more obsessed with the Count than the Brits had been. During his time in Paris, he rubbed shoulders with some of the most famous people of the age. Notorious Italian adventurer Giacomo Casanova was somewhat randomly in Paris setting up one of the world's first national lotteries,
These
and
drawings
frequently
look crazy.
found himself seated at dinner tables along with the Count. Casanova is famous for having been the greatest lover in history, and yet
What?
even he was impressed by the Count's riz. Yeah, I'm too old to use that word, aren't I? Anyway, in his memoirs, Casanova referred to
Why
the
did I
Count
just
as
hear
being
this
both good-looking
30-year-old
and
man say
the
that?
perfect ladies' man. That's a bit like being called the god of football by Lionel Messi. Another famous face frequenting France's fabulous capital at the time was celebrated writer and philosopher Voltaire. And it's he who gives us perhaps the most famous description of the Count. He dubbed the Count of Saint-Germain the Wonder Man, a man who does not
Wonder
die
Man.
and knows everything. Again, that's some pretty serious praise, this time from one of history's
That's crazy
great
glaze.
intellectuals. But it also leads me neatly onto the most controversial part of the Count's story. When Voltaire called him the man who doesn't die, he wasn't just spinning a fancy phrase. You see, the Count was a keen alchemist, and one of the central pursuits of alchemy is a search for the secret of eternal life. Well, our man the Count claims to have found it. By the time he arrived in
Wait,
Paris,
he actually wasn't. He actually is an alchemist.
claimed to be over 300 years old, a fact he would openly share with anyone who asked. Now, I know what you're thinking, but bear with me for a minute, because as crazy as all this may sound, there's actually some fairly compelling evidence that he was telling the truth. As we've already seen, the Count of Saint-Germain was no ordinary man. He spoke dozens of languages fluently, played the violin, and could speak on almost any subject as though he was an expert. Is it really feasible that one man could have achieved such mastery in just one lifetime? If you've ever seen the
Yeah, man, he can speak multiple different languages. They say he can speak like all the languages in Europe.
film Groundhog
knows
Day,
all
you'll
this
know that Bill
information.
Murray's character, Phil Connors, gets so bored of living out the same day over and over again, he starts randomly mastering a bunch of new skills, including playing the piano, speaking French, and making ice sculptures. Could something similar explain the Count's extraordinary abilities? I mean, polyglots aren't unheard of, but speaking every single European language to fluency is a rare, perhaps even a unique skill. And that was just one of the Count's many talents. Then there was his almost freakish knowledge of European history. Those who heard him talk of events long past often remarked that it almost seemed as though he'd lived through them. Well, what if he had? An artificially extended life would also help explain.
So he got immortality surgery. Oh my god. There's no way.
The Count's mysterious origins. If his family died hundreds of years earlier, then it was little wonder nobody could figure out who they were or where they came from. Okay, so I don't blame you if you're not convinced at this point, but there's still more evidence to come that he might have been telling the truth. Considering the tsunami-sized waves the Count was making in French high society, it was only a matter of time before the rising tide took him all the way to the very top. And waiting for him there was Louis XV, King of France, and his official chief mistress. Apparently that was a thing, Madame de Pompadour. During his time in France, the Count gained the trust of both. He convinced the king that he knew of some kind of secret coloring technique that would revolutionize the French textile industry. And the king clearly believed him because he set the Count up in his own purpose-built factory to produce dyes.
If he really is from back there, he might actually have some.
And the wide range of languages he spoke, the Count was tailor-made for the world of diplomacy. And in 1760, King Louis sent him to Amsterdam to negotiate peace between the French and the British in the 7 Years' War. He would spend just 2 months in the Dutch Republic, but that was apparently enough time for him to demonstrate yet another string of his frankly absurdly decked out bow when he helped set up a porcelain factory. He worked there as a furnace and colour specialist, and if that isn't an I'm immortal and I'm running out of new things to do kind of job, then I don't know what is. As had been the case in London, the Count had enjoyed a truly meteoric rise to the very top of French high society. But success of that kind of scale will always breed resentment. And it was whilst away on diplomatic business in the Dutch Republic that resentment produced real consequences for the first time. Several powerful people in the French court were concerned about the level of influence the Count appeared to have gained over the king. One of them was Etienne François de Choiseul, the French foreign minister. As it became clear that the Count's peace mission wasn't going to be a success, de Choiseul began sowing seeds of doubt in the king's mind. Perhaps this strange foreigner couldn't be trusted. Perhaps he'd been working against France's interests all along. De Choiseul's Grima Wormtongue impression seems to have done the trick, because soon enough, King Louis XV issued a warrant for the Count's arrest. But the Count used all that legendary charm of his to convince the Dutch authorities he was being set up, and they seemed to believe him.
He actually convinced them that he was getting set up?
Because rather than extradite him back to France, they allowed him to set sail for England in secret. But this time, the Count didn't stay in the land of tea and biscuits for long. Instead, he spent the following 20 years or so traveling the length and breadth of Europe. Tracking his movements during this period is difficult, not least because the Count seems to have adopted a different identity almost everywhere he went. In one city, he was Count Bellamare. in the next Night Schoning, in another Graf Zarogi.
Yeah, he was really going crazy. He had all type. Wait, he's the faceless man. Oh my god, this is the original faceless man.
He used at least half a dozen different aliases, and they are just the ones we know about. Whether he was trying to stay one step ahead of the French, or he simply enjoyed taking on new personas, we have no way of knowing. What we do know is that, in 1779, he turned up in the Duchy of Schleswig, today on the border between Denmark and Germany. As always, he wasted no time whatsoever in waltzing right to the very top of the local aristocracy, striking up a close friendship with Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. The prince was a student of occult, and so a man of mystery, just like the Count. All his talk of alchemy and eternal life was simply irresistible. The Count spent the following 5 years living in the prince's castle, working out a purpose-built lab where he carried out various alchemical experiments. Rumor has it he pulled off several seemingly impossible feats there, such as removing flaws from diamonds, and creating large gemstones by somehow combining smaller ones. I believe you can do that with sellotape.
What?
The prince thought of the Count as something akin to an oracle, and considered him.
So he was removing flaws from diamonds and taking like 1-point rubies and turning them into. He take 5 1-point rubies and turn them into a big ruby.
To be one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. But on the 27th of February 1784, something entirely unexpected happened. The Count of Saint-Germain died. Now I know what you're thinking.
Oh no.
That doesn't sound very bloody immortal. But here's the thing. I'm not actually finished yet. A year after his untimely demise, the Count is said to have attended a Masonic convention in Paris under the name of E. Eckert. And a year after that, he turned up in Russia for an audience with Catherine the Great. And it seems as though this zombie Count was only just getting started.
Huh?
Over 230 years have passed since then. But during this time, there have been literally dozens of different sightings of the Count all over the world, from India to Czech Republic. American author Guy Ballard claims to have met the Count whilst hiking on Mount Shasta in 1930. According to Ballard, the two became fast friends, and the Count dictated a series of books to Ballard that eventually went on to form the basis of a religious movement known as I Am.
He look like that drawing
At its
from
height,
earlier.
it
He got
had
that lazy
over
guy
1
still.
million followers. I Am
gotta
isn't
see,
the
bro.
only religious movement to have been influenced by the apparently dead Count. In fact, he's considered an important figure in Theosophy and a whole series of other New Age movements, many of which view him as a so-called ascended master, alongside the likes of Gautama Buddha, Jesus Christ, Confucius, and the Archangel
What is Gautama Buddha? Is that the name of the Buddha? Is that the name of the Buddha? I've never
Michael.
seen the full name.
That's quite
That's
some
it.
company. Followers of Theosophy have also linked the Count with several important historical figures throughout the ages,
thought it was
claiming
just
that the
the Buddha.
likes of Francis Bacon and Christopher Columbus, amongst
That's
many
crazy.
others, were in fact the Count's alter egos. Okay,
Christopher
I think
Columbus was an alter ego.
it's probably about time for the million-dollar question.
That's
Is
gotta
any of
be a
this actually
conspiracy
true?
theory.
Well, the short answer is yes. At least the basics. The Count of
What?
Saint-Germain was absolutely a real person. And many of the events of his fascinating life that we've talked about today are well documented. As for the rest of it, is it possible that he found the secret of eternal life? That he's been subtly guiding humanity for millennia? And that he might
He found law with the Opie no me. That boy he went crazy. He had the awakening. He used the immortality surgery. He's immortal. That's what it was.
might still be out there somewhere, even today?
Tricking me.
Nah. There's no denying that he was a truly mysterious figure. Even today, historians don't know for sure who he was or where he came from. Still, some of the seemingly strange elements of his story can be explained easily enough. One of the key pieces of evidence regarding the Count's immortality is his sheer mastery of so many different fields. The music, the languages, his knowledge on such a wide range of subjects, his secret techniques regarding dyes and gemstones. But the truth is, there was nothing supernatural about any of it. We know he was a talented musician and composer, but there's no indication he was anything out of the ordinary in that regard. At first, it might seem a little odd that we don't know where he trained, but since we don't know where he came from in the first place, that's to be expected. As for his other abilities, in most cases they were either exaggerated or made up altogether, usually by the Count himself. There's no evidence
that man was fabricating caps. He said, "Hey man, I was out there on the field fighting with Genghis Khan. I had the spears and everything. We was going crazy. I had the bow and arrow hitting the." That boy, he was capping crazy. He said, "I was on the horseback." That man was not on no horseback.
That his supposedly revolutionary dyes ever revolutionized anything in the French textile industry. And the ceramics factory he worked in the Dutch Republic went out of business not long afterwards. His so-called abilities with gemstones were almost certainly bogus too. When removing flaws from
So who? I thought somebody had vouched for him, saying that was true.
a diamond, he would keep the stone for several weeks, and the fixed version he produced at the end of it would often be of a slightly different size or
This man was basically a magician, bro. He said, "So I got two objects. This one right here is gonna be the one that you hold, and this one is the one that I'm holding. I'm gonna switch them out, sleight of hand."
cut. His near miraculous ability with languages is admittedly a little harder to explain, or at least it would be, if it was actually true. Almost every retelling of the Count's tale mentions his incredible knowledge of languages. But like so many other things about his story, it's all a little bit of truth wrapped up in a whole lot of hyperbole. I've already mentioned one Horace Walpole letter in this video, but he wrote several about the Count. Here's an excerpt from another. He spoke Italian and French with the greatest faculty. Though it was evident that neither was his language, he understood Polish and soon learnt to understand English and talk it a little.
So they was even capping about him knowing all the languages.
He wrote an English song in
He only knew like 2
1748,
languages.
but Spanish or Portuguese seemed his natural language.
Actually,
The Count had some serious language skills, I'm not denying that, but he clearly didn't speak every European language with the fluency of a native speaker. He was simply well-traveled and well-educated. The fact he spoke multiple languages is impressive, but it in no way proves or even suggests he was immortal. As for his remarkable knowledge of world history and many other subjects, that's hard to judge from our vantage point over 200 years in the future. Several sources do specifically mention his impressive breadth and depth of knowledge, but we have no way of testing just how impressive it really was.
How did he know what was...
As far as I'm concerned, it seems more like...
Unless he was just fabricating all the cap. They were like, "So what was going on Genghis Khan's crew?" And then was like, "Oh yeah, back then, it was like 250 years ago. I was out there. It was a big war. 2,000 men versus 2,000 men on horseback. Actually, 2,000 men versus 8,000 men. We were on horseback. We were going crazy. We had the bow and arrow. We were drawing on back. That man was capping the whole time."
Likely the Count was simply an extremely intelligent and well-educated man, rather than an immortal demigod with magical powers. But hey, perhaps I'm just a cynic. Finally, there are all those sightings of the Count that occurred after his death. Again, it's essentially impossible to either verify or disprove them. But I did notice something interesting about all the people who claim to have bumped into the Count over the last 100 years or so. They are almost exclusively involved in one New Age movement or another, usually Theosophy. In other words, the people that claim to have met the Count were already believers. If you happen to be a Theosophist yourself, then that will probably...
Theosophy is spiritual philosophy blending Eastern and Western beliefs, emphasizing unity, karma, reincarnation, and divine wisdom.
Probably make perfect sense. Who else would the Count reveal himself to other than his followers? If
Then
you
they put the
aren't a
definition right
theosophist,
there. I wasn't-
well, it'll probably make perfect sense to you as
wasn't trying
well.
to go
Who else would be crazy
search.
enough to claim they'd bumped into an
Yeah.
immortal wizard, except someone who already believes in immortal wizards? I'm not the only one who's skeptical about the Count's immortal wizardy credentials either, by the way. Earlier in the video, I mentioned a couple of quotes from Voltaire and Casanova, but it turns out neither man was entirely taken in by the Count. Voltaire's reference to the Count as a wonder man that knew everything and never died is generally thought to have been satirical. And whilst Casanova really did compliment the Count's riz, his skill with the ladies, he also openly considered the Count to be both a liar and a fraud.
Bruh.
And as a notorious liar and fraud himself, Casanova probably knew what he was talking about in that department. In fact, I think it's another Casanova quote that sums up the Count of Saint-Germain best. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I have never seen a more intellectual or amusing charlatan than he." And I think that's exactly what the Count was. Not some kind of immortal wizard, but a simple conman. Actually, not a simple conman.
Man, he's
One
been
of
a
the
scammer
greatest
since day
conmen
one?
ever to have lived. I mean, think about it. In an era when where you came from and who you knew was everything, this nameless nobody somehow managed to infiltrate the upper echelons of the aristocracy on sheer balls and wit alone. He befriended kings, dined with some of the most famous faces in history, and convinced half the world he was some kind of immortal mystic. He was basically a posh Rasputin. And if he'd managed to pull that trick off once, it would have been impressive. But to do it at least half a dozen times,
Yeah, he was doing.
all over Europe,
He was going to all the different countries. He was like, "Oh yeah, this was me. I've been alive.
was
since,
downright
been
remarkable.
alive for 400 years."
But hang on a
300
second, if the Count of
300
Saint-Germain really was just an ordinary meat and bones man like the rest of us, who the hell was he? He should have a traceable family line, a home, a paper trail, something, anything. And it turns out, maybe he did.
Oh,
According to Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel,
We
the
found
Count
him.
gave up a few final secrets on his deathbed. Among them, he claimed that he was
Found the
88
Count.
years old when he arrived in Schleswig, and that he was a son of Francis II Rákóczi, a Hungarian nobleman. Rákóczi was the leader of a war of independence against the notorious Habsburg dynasty, and, fearing his eldest son Leopold might become a target in the conflict, he faked the child's death when he was just 4 years old, issuing a false birth certificate. According to the theory, that child would grow up in secret, eventually becoming
That's his-
the Count of Saint-Germain. In many ways,
that's a good theory. The old king, his son. He was like, "Hey man, I think my son might become a target, so we gonna have to fake his death. We gonna have to fake him being dead." And then now, bro's like, I'm technically not a. Hey, I'm finna go around and say I've been alive for 400 years.
that would make a lot of sense, neatly explaining both the
nobody know
mystery
him.
surrounding the Count's past and also his high level of education. But before we call this case closed, there is still some room for doubt. For one thing, the timelines are a little odd. If the Count was indeed 88 when he arrived in Schleswig,
88.
that would mean he was born in 1691 when his father was 15 years old. That's certainly possible, but it would have been fairly unusual. More importantly, there's the simple fact that the man who called himself the Count of Saint-Germain spent almost his entire life lying about who and what he was. Like the boy who cried wolf, how can we be certain he was telling the truth that final time? The simple answer is that we can't, and given how much time has passed, we will likely never know for certain just who he really was. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Whichever way you look at it, the Count of Saint-Germain was a remarkable individual, and whether or not you believe he was truly immortal, one thing's for sure, the legend he created certainly is. Thanks for watching. Just a
That's crazy, bro. He really walked around through like 10, 15 different countries. That man, he was going around saying, "Yeah, I was really back alive during them Genghis Khan days. We was going crazy up on the horseback, shooting them bows. I could tell y'all all the stories. That was really me back there. I was going crazy." That man was straight capping out with his ass. Hey man, the original video will be in the description. My link will be to. I'm live on Twitch at Twitchy with 3 Ys. This is my Twitch, but that's my Instagram actually. I'm live every day.